Welcome back to Sleep Storyteller, where every night is a new adventure, and every story is a journey into the unknown. I'm so glad you're here, ready to relax, unwind, and let the gentle sound of rain guide you into a peaceful slumber. As we begin tonight's story, I invite you to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the world outside fade away. Remember, this is your space, a place to let go, to dream, and to find the calm you need. If you're ready for tonight's story, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below sharing what helps you relax most at night. Now, let's begin. The Keeper of Lost Tales, the wind that moved through the old forest carried stories with it. Not the loud kind, not the tales sung in village halls or told around bright fires, but the soft ones, the stories that never found a home. They drifted on the breeze, fragments of memory and whisper, slipping between leaves and curling around tree trunks, hoping someone might listen. At the heart of that forest stood a house. It was not grand, not shining, but old and quiet, built from wood so weathered it had learned to bend with the seasons. Moss clung to its walls, ivy curled around its windows, and the air around it smelled of earth and rain in something softer, the scent of words left unspoken. This was the home of the Keeper of Lost Tales. Her name had been forgotten long ago, replaced only by her purpose. She was neither young nor old, neither light nor shadow, but something in between, a presence that had always been there, sitting just beyond the edge of memory. It was her task to gather the stories that had no ending, no teller, no place to belong. Every night, when the sky turned soft with dusk, she would open her door, the stories would come, they drifted in with the wind, gathering at the edges of her doorstep like autumn leaves. Some were only a few words long, the last thought of a child before sleep took them, or a single sentence carried on the breath of someone too afraid to speak aloud. Others were longer, thicker with memory and longing, the stories of lives half-lived or love left unspoken. The keeper would gather them all, her hands were gentle, her touch light, as she wove the stories together. She did not write them down, paper was too thin, too fragile to hold such weight. Instead, she wove them into the air itself, her fingers tracing patterns that shimmered like mist above her table. Each strand of story caught the light, turning gold or silver, or sometimes a deep, sorrowful blue. The house was full of these stories, not in shelves or books, but in the very walls, the floor, the air itself. If someone were to stand there, very still, and listen with a quiet heart, they might hear them. Soft voices, layered upon one another, telling stories too gentle to be remembered by the world, but the keeper was alone, no one came to her house. No footsteps found her path. No hands knocked on her door. She was not lonely, at least, not in the way people meant when they said the word. Her company was the stories, the fragments of lives that had slipped between the cracks, and they filled her days and nights with quiet conversation. And yet, there was one thing the keeper had begun to notice: the stories were fading, not all at once, not suddenly, but slowly, gently, like morning mist lifting from the ground. Some stories no longer held their shape. They unraveled at the edges, their words slipping away like sand through fingers. The keeper would catch them, as best she could, weaving them back together with patient hands. But each time, they came apart a little faster. It was not the stories themselves, she knew. It was the world, The world had forgotten how to listen. People still spoke, still told tales, but they no longer left space for silence, the kind of silence that stories needed to settle in, to take root, to grow. Without that silence, the lost tales had nowhere to go. They drifted through the forest, becoming thinner, weaker, until even the keeper could barely hold them. That was why, on this night, this quiet, silver night, with the moon thin as a whisper, the keeper left her house. It was the first time in a very long time. She stepped into the forest, her cloak trailing over moss and fallen leaves, the soft glow of her stories clinging to her fingertips like fireflies. The air was thick with silence, broken only by the rustle of her steps and the soft sigh of wind through the trees. She walked without path or direction. The stories would guide her. They tugged at her heart, gentle as a child's hand, leading her through the forest's endless hush. She passed ancient trees, their bark carved with forgotten names, and clearings where the grass glowed faintly with the memory of old fires. The forest remembered, and somewhere, at the heart of all that remembering, the keeper knew she would find it, the place where the first lost tale was born. It was not a house, or a cave, or even a clearing. It was a feeling, a space in the world where silence and story first met. The stories had been born there, from the breath of the earth itself, before people learned to speak them. It was the place where stories waited to be found. The keeper walked until her feet knew the way, and there, in the hush between one breath and the next, she saw it. A tree stood at the heart of the forest. Its branches were bare, though no season had stripped them, and its bark shimmered faintly with words no one had ever spoken aloud. They had been born here, in the silence, and they had waited. Some were ancient, some so new they trembled like candle flames. They were all still waiting. The keeper placed her hand against the tree. The stories stirred. They knew her touch. They knew her heart. They reached for her, curling like smoke around her fingers, pressing their weight into her palms. They were heavy, heavier than memory, heavier than silence, but she held them all the same. The keeper closed her eyes. She breathed, and for the first time in a long time, she spoke. It was not a loud voice. It was not a voice meant for crowds or songs or shouts. It was the voice of someone who knew how to listen, soft, steady, shaped by silence as much as sound. And the words she spoke were simple. I remember you. The story stilled, and then, softly, so softly, they began to glow, the forest filled with light, and the keeper stood, surrounded by stories remembered, no longer lost. The glow of the stories lingered long after the keeper lowered her hand from the tree. Soft light clung to her fingers, each one dusted with memory, each touch a whisper of something remembered. The tree stood silent now, no longer shimmering, but not empty either. The words had not disappeared, they had only shifted, settling deeper into the bark, like secrets content to wait a little longer. The keeper stood quietly. The silence around her thick and soft, a hush so gentle it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. She knew the stories were not saved, not yet. Remembering was only the first step. The stories needed to be told, not shouted, not written in bold ink across the sky, but spoken softly, like a lullaby at the edge of sleep. They needed space to breathe, to drift through the air, to settle into the hearts of those who had forgotten how to listen. The keeper turned back toward her house. The path she had followed was gone, swallowed by the shifting forest, but she did not need it. The stories would guide her. They remembered the way home, even if the forest did not. Soft threads of light curled through the trees, leading her back with a gentleness only stories knew. The air was cool, the scent of earth and moss rising like the breath of something very old, something that had been waiting longer than time could measure. The keeper walked without hurry, her steps as soft as her voice, her presence as quiet as memory itself. The house appeared before her like a memory rising through mist. Its walls were worn, its roof bowed slightly with the weight of years and silence, but the windows glowed faintly now. Not with candlelight, not with flame, but with story, soft golden threads weaving through the glass, curling into the air like the breath of something dreaming. The keeper stepped inside, the stories followed, they filled the house like mist, gathering along the edges of the floor, curling around the wooden beams, brushing the windows like fingertips on old glass. They did not speak, not yet, but they waited, patient and quiet, for the keeper to begin. She moved through the house slowly, her fingers tracing the wood, the fabric, the air itself. Every surface remembered her touch. Every wall remembered her voice. The house was more than wood and stone, it was a vessel, a cradle for every story that had ever been lost, and now, it was full again, but the keeper knew, stories were not meant to stay, they were meant to travel. They were meant to slip from mouth to ear, from ear to heart, to take root in the quiet spaces people carried inside them. They were not meant to be held like treasures, locked away from the world. Stories were the breath between silence and sound. Without listeners, they would unravel again, slipping back into mist and forgetting. The keeper knelt beside the hearth, the fire was cold, the ashes long settled, but she did not need flame to begin. She placed her hands on the floor, the heart of the house, and the stories stirred. They rose around her, soft and golden, some bright and eager, others faint and fragile. Each one carried a weight, the weight of memory, of longing. Of the silence between words, the keeper took a breath, and she began to tell them. Her voice was soft, not a song, not a shout, but the voice of someone speaking to the night itself. She told the stories not in order, not in lines or chapters, but the way stories wish to be told, drifting from one to the next, following threads only the heart could see. A story of a lost traveler became a story of a forgotten door, which became a story of a tree that remembered every hand that had ever touched its bark. The house held the stories gently, each word settling into the air, into the walls, into the space between breaths, but the keeper was not telling them for the house. She was telling them for the forest, for the wind, for the silence that stretched between the trees, waiting for something to fill it. The stories drifted out through the windows, through the cracks in the walls, through the open door. They floated into the night, carried on the same soft wind that had brought them here in the first place. But they were no longer lost, they were remembered, they were told, and somewhere, far from the keeper's house, in places where no one had spoken to the dark in a very long time, someone might hear, the child half asleep, dreaming with eyes barely open, a traveler beside a dying fire, their heart too heavy for silence, a lonely soul staring at the stars. Searching for something they could not name, the stories would find them. The keeper did not need to know their names, or see their faces. That was not her task. Her task was only to remember, to hold the stories long enough for them to find their way back into the world, and so she spoke, all through the night, her voice soft as mist, her stories light as breath. One after another, she gave them back to the world, until the house was no longer heavy with silence, but light with remembering. By dawn, the stories were gone, not lost, but carried. The keeper sat in the quiet, her hands resting gently on her knees, her breath slow and steady. She was alone again, but the silence was different now. It was no longer empty, it was full of the stories that had passed through it, stories that would drift across forests and rivers, over villages and fields, until they found someone who knew how to listen, and the keeper, as always, would be waiting for the next lost tale to find her door. Morning crept slowly through the forest, soft and pale, as though the light itself was careful not to disturb the stories still drifting through the air. The keeper sat in her chair by the window, her hands wrapped around a simple cup of warm tea, her eyes half closed. The house was quieter now, though not empty. It was never truly empty, not while the walls still remembered every word, every sigh, every breath of a tale once told. The silence here was not hollow, it was full. Full of echoes, soft enough to go unnoticed, but present like the hush before the first snowfall. The keeper's gaze wandered past the glass, where the mist was just beginning to lift from the forest floor. It curled around tree trunks, clung to the branches like silver thread, and then slowly dissolved into the cool air, leaving nothing behind but memory. The stories had left the house, carried away by the gentle hush of night, but the keeper knew they were never truly gone. Some would find their way into dreams, curling into the quiet spaces between waking thoughts. Others would settle into hearts, unnoticed at first. Until one day they would rise like the scent of rain on dry earth, sudden and familiar, and someone would remember a story they never knew they had heard, and some would return. The keeper rose, her movement slow, unhurried. There was no urgency here. Time was a softer thing in her house, measured not in hours or days, but in the ebb and flow of stories. Some nights, they came like rain, falling steady and gentle, filling every corner. Other nights, only a single tale would arrive, fragile and flickering like the last light of a candle. She opened the door, the forest breathed in, and the first story of the new day drifted inside. It was small, almost weightless, just a whisper. Really, a single thread of silver curling through the air. The keeper held out her hand, letting it settle on her palm, where it glowed faintly in the morning light. It was a story of waiting. She could feel it in the way it trembled, in the way its edges curled in on themselves, like something trying to stay small, unnoticed. Stories like this were delicate, half-formed, never spoken aloud, born in the quiet between heartbeats. They were the hardest to hold, and the easiest to lose. The keeper cupped her hands around it, shielding it from the morning breeze, and carried it inside. At her table, she laid it carefully on the worn wood, her fingers tracing its fragile shape. It was not ready to be told, not yet. Some stories needed time to unfold, to stretch and breathe before they could be spoken. This one was still hiding inside itself, too shy to reveal its heart. The keeper understood. She hummed softly, a sound not quite a melody, not quite a word, just a thread of sound to hold the silence together. The story shifted, trembling slightly, like something stirring in sleep. It would wait. The keeper moved through the house, her hands brushing the edges of old memories, her steps soft on the worn floorboards. The stories that had left in the night still lingered here, faint echoes in the wood and air. They would always leave traces, like footprints in soft earth, proof that they had been. that they had passed through this place, some would return, changed and grown, seeking the keeper's touch once more. Others would never come back, their journeys complete, their endings found. The keeper had long ago made peace with both. She stepped out into the small garden behind the house, where wildflowers grew in loose, gentle clusters. Their petals caught the morning light, trembling with dew, each one holding its own quiet story, of sunlight and rain, of roots reaching deep into dark soil, of petals opening to the sky without fear. Stories were everywhere, if you knew how to listen, in the rustling leaves, in the slow creak of old trees, in the hush between bird songs. The forest itself was a story, ancient and ever-changing, a tale without an ending, told in roots and branches and earth. The keeper knelt beside the flowers, her hands resting on the damp earth. She closed her eyes, feeling the slow pulse of life beneath her fingertips. The earth remembered every footstep, every fallen leaf, every story whispered in the dark. There was comfort in that. Even the forgotten things were never truly lost. The keeper opened her eyes. A single flower, smaller than the rest, stood near the edge of the path. Its petals were pale, almost translucent, as though it belonged half to the world of stories and half to the waking world. The keeper touched it gently, and for a moment, she felt the faintest pulse of something, a memory, a name, a fragment of a story not yet told. It would find its way, when the time was right. Everything did. The keeper stood, brushing earth from her hands, and turned back to the house. The silver thread of story still lay on her table, waiting patiently. It would wait as long as it needed. Stories had no sense of time, only of longing. The keeper would listen when it was ready to speak, and in the meantime, she would tend the house, the forest, and the silence, the cradle where stories were born, and where they returned, again and again, like the turning of the stars, and somewhere, far beyond the forest's edge, someone would wake with a story on their lips, a story they couldn't quite remember, but couldn't quite forget. The keeper would be waiting, always waiting, for the next lost tale to find its way home. The morning stretched into afternoon, soft and slow, as though time itself had decided to drift. In the house of the keeper, silence was not the absence of sound but the presence of waiting, a hush filled with things not yet said, stories not yet ready to unfold. The small silver story still lay on the table, fragile and light, like a single breath held too long. The keeper did not rush it. Stories, especially the quiet ones, needed gentleness. They were like wild creatures, only willing to show themselves when the world was soft enough to listen. The keeper's house was that softness. She moved through her rooms, tending to small things, folding a worn blanket, smoothing the pages of a book left open too long, sweeping a few fallen leaves that had drifted in through the open door. Each movement was slow, deliberate, a conversation between her hands and the house itself. The house was alive, in its own way, not with voice or breath, but with memory. It held the stories that had passed through it, carried them in the worn wood and softened edges, the way old trees carry the memory of every storm. The keeper did not own the house, she belonged to it. Just as much as the stories did. Outside, the forest stirred, a breeze carried the scent of damp earth and green leaves, of distant rain still clinging to moss and stone. The forest, too, was listening. It always did. It was a patient listener, holding stories long after the world had forgotten them. The keeper stepped outside, her feet bare on the cool earth, her breath blending with the soft hush of wind through branches. There were paths in the forest, not the kind marked by footsteps or signs, but paths made of memory. The keeper knew how to follow them. They led her where stories gathered, where forgotten things waited to be found. She followed one now. It led her deeper than she had gone in many days. Past trees older than names, past stones worn smooth by time and silence. The forest darkened as she walked, not with fear, but with the weight of things remembered too long. Some stories hid in that darkness, too heavy or too broken to return on their own. The keeper paused at the edge of a small clearing. A single tree stood in the center, its bark smooth and pale, its branches reaching upward like hands open to the sky. This was a remembering tree, one of the oldest, one that had stood long before the keeper herself had first stepped into the forest. She placed her palm against its bark. The tree shivered, not with cold, but with recognition. The keeper closed her eyes. And the stories came. They were not bright, not like the silver threads that came to her house in the night. These were heavier, darker, stories weighed down by silence, by years left untold. They curled around her fingers, thick and heavy, each one a knot of memory too tangled to find its way home. The keeper did not fear them. She knew how to hold heavy stories. With her fingertips resting on the tree, she began to hum, a low, soft sound, older than words, older than the forest itself. The sound was not meant to wake the stories, but to soothe them, to remind them they were not alone. Slowly, they began to loosen. One by one, the stories uncurled, lifting from the bark like mist rising from the ground. They floated around the keeper, circling her hands, brushing against her skin. They were not ready to be told, not yet, but they were no longer hiding. That was enough. The keeper opened her eyes. The stories drifted back into the tree, settling into its branches, its roots, its heart. They would wait there until the forest was ready to release them, or until someone came who needed them. Not all stories were meant for the keeper. Some were meant for wanderers, for those who walked too far and forgot how to turn back. The keeper stepped back, her hand falling away from the bark. The tree stood quiet again, but not empty. Never empty. She made her way back through the forest. Her steps soft, her breath steady. The house was waiting, its windows glowing faintly in the late afternoon light. The silver story was still on her table, still waiting for her touch. She sat beside it. The story was no longer trembling. It had grown, just a little, its edges less fragile, its glow a bit stronger. It was ready to show her more. The keeper laid her hands on either side of it, not to catch it, but to hold the space around it, a cradle made of stillness and listening. The story stirred, and it began. It was a story of a girl who walked in silence, a girl who knew the names of every tree, not because anyone had taught her, but because the trees themselves had whispered them to her. She walked paths no one else could see, paths made of memory and mist, paths that led only where stories could follow. She was not the keeper, not yet, but the forest was already listening. The keeper watched the story unfold, her hands still and steady. This was how stories were born, not all at once, but in soft moments, in glimpses and threads, each one finding its shape only when it was ready to be remembered. The story drifted upward, curling into the air like smoke, until it disappeared into the rafters of the house, joining all the others waiting there. The keeper smiled, just a little. Another story had found its way home, and somewhere, deep in the forest, another story began to stir, a new one. Not yet formed, not yet remembered, but already longing to be told. The keeper would be there when it arrived, as she always was, as she always would be. Dusk settled gently over the forest, a veil of soft shadow weaving through the trees, quieting even the smallest sounds. The keeper stood at the threshold of her house, her hands resting lightly on the worn wooden frame, eyes tracing the edges of the world as it folded into night. The air smelled of earth cooling after a long day, of leaves still damp from the mist that clung to them each morning. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, low and steady, a single note that hung in the air before being swallowed by silence. This was the hour the keeper knew best. It was the hour when the stories began to stir. The silver story on her table had settled into itself, content to wait, no longer trembling or uncertain. It had become a thread woven into the house, part of its breath, its heartbeat. Not every story needed to be told right away. Some simply needed a place to rest. The keeper stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a sound so soft it was barely there. The house exhaled around her, wood and stone easing into night. A single candle flickered on the windowsill, its light brushing the edges of books stacked high, its glow finding the gentle curves of cups left to dry. She moved through the room slowly, her fingers trailing along shelves and tabletops, pausing now and then to touch a book's worn spine or a feather tucked between pages. Each object was a memory, a story left behind by someone who had once needed this place. Not all who found the keeper's house were seeking stories, some were simply seeking silence. She remembered them, each one. The girl with the voice too soft to be heard, who slept curled beneath the window until the house learned to whisper just for her. The man with hands that shook, who sat at the table until the trembling stopped, his silence a story the house cradled without question. The child who spoke to the shadows as though they were old friends. And perhaps they were. The house had room for all of them. The keeper stepped to the far corner of the room, where the oldest shelf stood, a crooked thing, leaning slightly to the left, its wood worn smooth by years of careful hands. This was where the oldest stories lived, the ones that had come to her before she had even known she was a keeper. She drew her fingers along the spines, each one unmarked, each one a plain cover hiding the weight of worlds inside. Some of these stories had come from the forest itself, whispered to her by trees and stones, by the hush of water beneath ice. Others had arrived in the hands of wanderers, placed gently into hers before they vanished back into the mist. She chose one without looking, the way she always did. The cover was cool beneath her hand, its edges softened by time and touch. She carried it to the table, setting it beside the silver thread still resting there, and slowly opened it. The pages were blank, of course they were. The oldest stories were never written in ink. They were written in silence, in memory, in the breath between words. They could only be read by those willing to listen. The keeper closed her eyes, her hands resting gently on the open pages, and the story began. It was a story of a boy who could hear the stones sing. He was born in a village where no one spoke of such things, where the world was solid and certain. Where stories were something for children, not for those who tilled the earth or mended nets. But the boy could not help what he heard. The stones sang to him, not with words, but with hums and sighs, with notes too low for most ears to catch. They sang of the weight of years, of footsteps long gone, of rain that softened their edges and wind that carved their names. The boy tried to silence the songs. He stuffed his ears with wool, stayed away from the river where the oldest stones lay half buried in moss. But the songs found him anyway, in the tremble of the earth beneath his feet, in the shape of shadows cast by the walls of his home. And so one night, when the village slept, the boy left. He walked where the stones led him, following the songs only he could hear, until the village was nothing but a memory behind him and the world ahead was a sea of whispering earth. The keeper's fingers traced the edges of the book's pages as the story unfolded within her mind, a tale told without voice, without ink, but as clear as though it had been carved in stone. The boy walked for days, for years, for lifetimes, until the songs led him to a place where no stories were. Forgotten, a house, small and quiet, nestled at the edge of a forest that remembered everything, and there, at the threshold of that house, the boy placed his hands against the wood, and the stories whispered back to him. The keeper opened her eyes. The candle had burned lower, its light softer, shadows stretched longer. The book before her was still blank, but the story was there now, no longer waiting, no longer hiding. Some stories did not need to be told aloud, some simply needed to be held. She closed the book gently, running her hand once more along its cover, and placed it back on the shelf where it had always belonged. The silver thread beside her shimmered faintly, as though it, too, had listened. The keeper smiled, a soft smile, the kind only someone who had held 1,000 stories could wear. The house settled into the hush of night, and the stories slept, but somewhere, far away. A child dreamed of stones that sang, and the keeper listened, as she always did, as she always would. The night lay thick and still, a blanket of soft silence spread across the forest, wrapping around each tree, each stone, each fallen leaf. Inside the keeper's house, that silence was something more, not emptiness, but presence, a quiet alive with listening. The silver thread on the table glowed faintly, pulsing like the slow, steady breath of something dreaming. It no longer trembled. It knew it was safe here, held in a place where stories had always been welcome. The keeper sat beside it, her hands resting palm down on the table, fingers barely brushing the wood. Her breath moved in time with the house. Slow and steady, the rhythm of one who knew how to wait. And wait she did. Not all stories spoke at once. Some took their time. The forest beyond the walls stirred in its sleep, leaves rustling with whispers too soft for most to hear. The keeper heard them, though. She always did. The stories living within the forest were never truly silent. Even when no one walked the paths, even when no footsteps disturbed the earth, the forest remembered. It remembered the girl who once carried a lantern made of stars, each tiny light a memory she had gathered from the edges of dreams. It remembered the old man who had walked with a cane carved from the branch of the first tree to fall, his steps slow but certain. Each one carrying the weight of stories left unsaid. The keeper herself was part of that remembering. She had once been a child who found her way to this house, not because she was searching for it, but because the stories had been searching for her. The house had opened its door to her as though it had been waiting all along. And maybe it had. That was a story the house had never told. The keeper's fingers traced the air above the silver thread, and the thread stirred in response. It stretched, just slightly, unwinding a single strand that curled upward like smoke. A flicker, a fragment, a piece of something much larger waiting just beyond the edges of the world. The keeper followed it with her eyes. Her breath steady, her heart quiet, the strand shimmered, then settled into a shape, the faintest outline of a door, hanging there in the air, framed by nothing but silence. It was not a door made for hands to open. It was a door only stories could pass through. The keeper knew this door. She had seen it before. It was the door of lost beginnings. There were doors for all things, doors for endings, for middles, for the quiet pauses between chapters. But the door of lost beginnings was special. It was the place where stories went when they had never been told, when they had been swallowed before they could even take their first breath. The keeper rose from her chair, her steps soft, her shadow stretching long across the room. The door shimmered faintly, waiting. She stepped toward it. The air around the door was neither warm nor cold. It was the absence of both, the hush of a space that existed only for a moment at a time. The keeper reached out, not to touch the door, but to touch the space around it, to let it know she was there. The door opened. There was no sound, no creak of wood or scrape of hinge. It opened the way a memory opens, softly, quietly, without resistance. Beyond the door was not darkness, not light, but something in between, the place where stories began before anyone was ready to hear them. The keeper stepped through. The space beyond was vast and still. A sea of threads floating weightless, each one shimmering faintly, each one a story that had never found its voice. Some were small, a single breath, a flicker of an idea. Others were vast, tangled webs of memory and hope and silence. The keeper walked among them, her hands at her sides, her breath calm. The stories stirred as she passed, brushing against her fingers like children reaching for a hand in the dark. They knew her. They knew she was someone who could carry them. She paused beside one thread, a silver blue strand no thicker than a hair, trembling slightly in the stillness. It was a story that had almost begun, a story of a boy standing at the edge of a frozen lake. His breath curling in the air, his heart full of questions he didn't know how to ask. The keeper lifted the thread. It was light in her hand, so fragile it seemed it might vanish at the slightest touch. But the keeper knew how to hold fragile things. She carried the thread back toward the door, back into the warmth of her house, and set it gently beside the silver story still resting on her table. The two threads reached for each other, drawn together by the quiet gravity of stories longing to be told. The keeper watched them for a moment, her eyes soft, her smile barely there. There was no need to hurry. Stories knew when it was time. She returned to her chair, her hands once again resting on the table, her breath matching the gentle rise and fall of the house around her. The threads settled into place, curling together, their edges blurring until they were no longer two stories, but one. The keeper listened, and the story began. It was a story of a boy at the edge of a frozen lake, a boy who saw a door reflected in the ice, a door made of silver light, shimmering just beneath the surface. He didn't know where it led. He didn't know who waited on the other side, but something in him knew he had to open it, even if no one else could see it, even if no one else believed it was there. The keeper's eyes closed, her breath soft, her hand steady. The story drifted upward, weaving itself into the air, into the rafters, into the house itself. Another story, no longer lost, another story, home, outside, the forest side, the stories in the trees, in the stones, in the wind. They all knew. The keeper was listening, as she always did, as she always would. The house had grown quieter, though it was never silent. There was always something breathing in the walls, a faint, steady rhythm like the heartbeat of something ancient and kind. The keeper could feel it beneath her fingertips as she trailed her hand along the worn wooden table, brushing lightly over the silver threads now entwined with the golden fragment she had carried back from the forest. Stories needed time to find their shape, to settle into themselves. The keeper understood this better than most. She had seen stories arrive tangled in knots of fear and silence. Stories that had been carried too long in hearts too heavy to bear them. And she had seen them soften, unravel, bloom. Once they knew they were safe, the silver and gold threads pulsed faintly now, their edges blurring where they met, blending into a single braid. 3 stories, no longer apart, but not yet whole. The keeper stepped back, letting them rest. She knew better than to rush a story. Instead, she turned her attention to the shelves that lined the walls. They were dark with age, bowed beneath the weight of books and objects that had found their way here over the years. Some were gifts, left by travelers who had come seeking stories and left a piece of their own behind. Others had simply appeared, a feather resting on the windowsill, a stone worn smooth as water, a bell that rang only when no one was listening. Each object held a story. Some whispered constantly, filling the room with soft murmurs, too quiet to disturb but too constant to ignore. Others lay silent, their stories waiting for the right hand to touch them, the right heart to listen. The keeper's fingers traced the spine of a slender book bound in green cloth, the edges worn to softness. It had no title, no name, just the memory of the hands that had held it before. She opened it gently. The pages were blank, not because there was no story, but because the story had never been written down. It was a story told in silence, in glances across rooms, in the way 2 people stood side by side without needing words. The keeper smiled. Some stories were like that. She placed the book back on the shelf, her fingers lingering a moment longer than necessary. Even silence deserved to be remembered. Outside, the mist had begun to lift, revealing glimpses of the forest beyond the clearing. The path of unfinished tales had faded back into the earth, its stories returned to waiting. The keeper knew it would appear again, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps not for many days. The forest moved at its own pace, the stories choosing when they were ready to be found. She returned to the table, to the silver and gold braid, now resting more easily, as though it had found a comfortable place. The 3 threads were no longer separate strands, but a single cord, not yet a story, but something close. The boy at the frozen lake, the girl at the edge of the horizon, and the story in between, the one that had been lost before it could begin. The keeper could sense it now, the outline of something larger, a shape just beneath the surface. She did not pull at it. She simply listened, and in the listening, the story began to breathe. It was a story of crossings, of places where worlds touched, where the veil between them was thin enough to slip through if you knew how to listen. The boy had seen it first in the reflection beneath the ice, the silver door that shimmered just out of reach. The girl had seen it in the sky, where the edge of the world curved into a door made of light. Neither knew what lay beyond, but both had stepped forward. The keeper could feel the tug between them, the invisible thread that tied them together. 2 stories meant to meet, though they had never known each other's names. Some stories began long before their first word was spoken. The thread shimmered brighter, the braid tightening slightly, drawing itself together like hands clasping in the dark. The keeper felt the faintest pulse beneath her fingertips, as though the story itself had taken a breath. She left it there, stories were not meant to be pulled open like locked doors. They were meant to open themselves. When they were ready, when they knew they were safe, the keeper stepped back once more, her hands folded gently in front of her, her breath slowing to match the quiet rhythm of the house. There was no rush. The house would keep the story safe, the forest would remember its footsteps, and the keeper would listen, as she always had, as she always would. The house was awake, though it barely made a sound. Its breath was soft, woven into the hush of morning, the hush of stories stirring just beneath the skin of the walls. The keeper stood by the window, her hands wrapped around a simple clay cup, steam rising in fragile ribbons toward the rafters. Outside, the mist had returned. Heavier than before, pooling low across the ground like a living thing, curling around the roots of trees and the edges of stone. Somewhere beyond the clearing, the forest waited, ancient, patient, always listening. The silver and gold braid still lay on the table. It had changed in the night. The keeper could see it even from across the room. The way the threads had shifted, no longer lying flat, but lifted ever so slightly, as though the story itself was rising, reaching, stretching into shape. The threads were no longer separate, they had found each other, twined tighter than before, the edges blending until they were almost indistinguishable. Almost. The story was not whole yet. The keeper knew the signs, the faint tremor in the air, the quiet pulse that meant a story was still listening for something, still waiting for the piece that would complete it. Some stories waited for an ending. Others waited for a beginning. This story waited for a voice, not hers. Stories did not belong to the keeper, no matter how many passed through her hands. They were travelers, pausing to rest, to gather strength before they found their true tellers, the voices meant to carry them into the world. The keeper set her cup aside and approached the table. Her fingers hovered just above the braid, not touching, only sensing. It was close now, the boy at the frozen lake. Standing on the thin skin of winter, peering down at the silver door beneath the ice, the girl at the edge of the horizon, her lantern flickering in the endless dusk, the line between sky and sea no longer a border but an opening, two stories, one thread, and yet, something was missing still, the voice to call them together, the hand to turn the key. The keeper did not force it. Instead, she turned to the shelves. The house remembered every voice that had passed through its doors, every story left unfinished, every whisper of hope, fear, longing. Some voices had faded, leaving only the echo of their presence. Others lingered still, waiting for the moment they would be needed again. The keeper ran her fingers over the spines of books and journals, over the worn edges of letters and folded maps. Each one held a fragment, a word, a breath, a heartbeat. She paused at a small box, its lid carved with a simple spiral, worn smooth by years of touch. It was no larger than her palm, held shut by a single silver thread, not a story, but a memory. The keeper unknotted the thread, and the box opened without a sound. Inside lay a scrap of parchment, no larger than her hand. The words were faded, nearly erased by time, but the keeper did not need to read them. She remembered. It was the voice of the first storyteller who had ever crossed the house's threshold, long before the keeper herself had come to live here. Long before the forest had grown around them both. A voice full of wonder and hesitation, a voice that had not known it was a storyteller until the house itself had told her so. The keeper held the parchment between her fingers, feeling the warmth that still clung to it, the faint heartbeat of the voice it had once belonged to. Some stories needed to hear a voice before they could speak their own. She carried the parchment back to the table, holding it close to the braid of silver and gold. The threads did not stir at first, but then, slowly, they began to tremble, drawn toward the memory of the voice, the echo of a story long since told. The keeper did not speak, she simply listened. And in the listening, the story began to shift. The boy at the frozen lake stepped forward, his breath curling white in the air, his hand pressed to the ice. The girl at the edge of the horizon turned, her lantern lifting higher, the light reaching toward the unseen shore. Between them, the silver door began to open, not with force, not with a sound, but with a breath, a sigh, a single word that neither could hear, but both understood. The keeper stood still, her own breath quiet, her heart beating in time with the story. It was not hers to tell, but it was hers to hold. The voice would come, as it always did, not from the house, not from the keeper, but from the world beyond the forest. Where stories waited for the hearts meant to carry them, the silver and gold thread settled, the trembling easing into stillness, the shape of the story nearly complete. Nearly, the keeper smiled, soft, knowing, and left the story to rest. There was no rush. There never was. The house would wait, the forest would wait, and the story would wait, until the voice came, until it was ready to be told. The house stood quiet beneath a sky heavy with stars, not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the deep, comforting hush of something whole, something complete, breathing softly after a long journey. The air itself seemed to hum with it, the gentle resonance of stories finding their resting place. The keeper sat by the window, her hands resting on the worn wood of the sill. Beyond the glass, the forest stood still, its mist curled low around the roots of ancient trees. There was no wind, no movement, only the patient breath of earth beneath sky, as though the world itself was listening. On the table, the silver and gold braid lay quietly. It no longer shimmered with unfinished light, no longer trembled with longing. It had found its shape, not a perfect circle, not a linear path, but something in between, a door, a threshold made of light and memory, a place where stories met and mingled, where endings softened into beginnings and every voice left an echo for the next to follow. The keeper had seen many stories come and go, some arriving tattered and torn, others fragile as moth wings, some bright and bold, too eager to hold still. But this one had been different. It had arrived in silence, it had waited to be found, and now, it waited again, not for the keeper, not for the house, but for the voice meant to carry it forward. The boy at the frozen lake had stepped through the silver door, his reflection vanishing beneath the ice, replaced by something brighter, a thread of light winding into the sky. The girl at the horizon had crossed her own threshold, her lantern swinging softly at her side, her footsteps leaving no mark, only a hush where her story had passed. They had not met, not yet, but they would. Stories always found each other in the end. The keeper rose, her fingers brushing the edge of the table one final time. The silver and gold door would remain, a quiet invitation for the voice meant to open it. The house would hold it safe, and the forest would guard the path that led to it. She stepped back into the shadows of the room, letting the soft glow of starlight touch the table, touch the braid, touch the stories resting between them. Some stories were never meant to be written down. Some stories were meant to be carried. In the curve of a smile, the hush of a breath, the warmth of a hand reaching for another, the keeper knew this. And so she let the story go, out into the mist, out into the waiting world, where someone, somewhere, would find it, and when they did, they would know, not how the story began, nor how it ended, but that it belonged to them. The house sighed softly, settling deeper into the earth, into itself. The keeper turned away from the window, her heart light, her hands empty. Tomorrow, another story would come, it always did, and the house, and the keeper, would be ready, for every story is only waiting to be found, and every heart is only waiting to listen. The house did not sleep. Not truly, even when its windows were dark and the forest outside was still, the house remained awake in the way old places often do, with one ear always listening, one breath always waiting. The keeper knew this, for she had felt it from the first night she had ever crossed the threshold. Back then, she had not yet understood what it meant to live in a house of stories, how the walls held memories the way bark held rings, how the air itself carried the weight of every whisper left behind. Tonight, the house was particularly awake. The silver and gold braid still lay on the table, but it had changed again, not in color or shape, but in presence. It no longer felt like something waiting to be discovered. Now it felt like something aware, aware of itself, aware of the house, and aware of the story that had carried it here. The keeper stood beside it, her hands still, her breath slow, as if the braid itself had drawn her into its rhythm. Stories are living things, she had learned. They breathe, they change, they grow, and sometimes, they wake up. This story was awake now, no longer content to lie quiet and patient, no longer waiting for the right voice to claim it. It had found something, or perhaps someone, beyond the house's walls, a presence that had brushed against its edges like fingertips trailing along the surface of water. The keeper could not see who or what it was, but the braid knew. It pulsed faintly, as though sensing a heartbeat somewhere beyond the mist, beyond the trees, beyond the edge of knowing. The keeper did not reach for it. Stories could not be held once they had begun to wake. They could only be followed. She stepped back, letting the faint glow of the braid soften into the hush of the room. Outside, the mist stirred, not from wind, but from movement, footsteps far off, just at the edge of hearing. Someone was coming, not to the house, not yet, but closer, closer than they had ever been before, and the story, the silver and gold braid, the boy and the girl, the lake and the horizon, was reaching for them. Somewhere beyond the mist, a voice was about to speak. The keeper listened, and waited. The house was not alone. It had always been part of something larger, the forest, the sky, the shifting mist that carried whispers through the trees. But now, for the first time in longer than the keeper could remember, it felt a presence outside its walls, not a passerby, not a wandering bird or restless wind, a soul, someone who belonged to the stories, though they did not yet know it themselves. The keeper stood in the doorway, her bare feet resting on the worn wood, her breath soft and even in the cool night air. The mist curled at the edges of the clearing, brushing against the stones and wildflowers, never crossing the invisible threshold that separated the house from the world beyond. But tonight, the mist had thinned. There was a path, faint, barely there, but enough, and someone was walking it. The keeper could feel them, the gentle tug at the edges of her senses, like a half-remembered melody drifting through the air. The silver and gold braid on the table trembled faintly, as though answering a silent call. Stories always knew their tellers. The house did not reveal itself easily. It waited for those who needed it, the ones who carried stories in their hearts without knowing how to speak them, the ones who had lost their voices or their way. But sometimes, when a story was ready, it reached out first. The keeper stepped into the clearing, the cool earth beneath her feet grounding her as she raised her eyes to the forest's edge. There was no figure in sight, no clear shape moving through the trees, but she could feel them, not far now, their footsteps light, hesitant, yet drawn forward by something older than fear. The story was calling them, the boy at the lake, standing above the silver door beneath the ice, the girl at the horizon, her lantern flickering against the sky's edge. Their threads had stretched into the world, searching, until they found someone listening, someone ready to follow the sound. The keeper knew better than to interfere. Stories did not belong to her. They belonged to those who carried them, whether they knew it or not. All she could do was leave the door open. She turned back to the house. Its windows soft with golden light, its walls breathing quiet welcome. The silver and gold braid lay still now, its pulse steady, no longer searching, only waiting. The keeper left the door ajar, not wide enough to invite, just wide enough to be found. The mist was no longer a wall, for as long as the keeper could remember, and her memory stretched further than her own years, further even than the stories she had gathered. The mist had stood as a veil, a gentle boundary between the house and the world beyond. It was neither a warning nor a threat, only a hush, a quiet pause between one breath and the next. It had been there when she arrived, a girl not much older than the stories she carried. When her footsteps first broke the silence of the clearing. The mist had parted for her then, not because she had known the way, but because the house had known her. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the mist was thin, no longer a barrier but a bridge, and somewhere beyond the trees, someone was crossing it. The keeper stood at the window, her fingers resting lightly on the glass, though the glass itself was cool, as if holding its breath. There was no sign of movement in the mist, no shadow passing between the trees, no flicker of lantern light, but the house felt it, and the house knew. A voice was drawing near, not a loud voice, not even a voice that had yet spoken aloud. Some voices began as whispers, hidden even from the ones who carried them, small, fragile things that curled deep within the heart, too quiet to name, but stories heard them all the same. The silver and gold braid on the table had grown still. No longer trembling, no longer twisting toward the unseen horizon. It was no longer searching, it was waiting. The keeper turned away from the window, her bare feet soft against the wooden floor, the house settling around her with a comfort that came only when a story was ready to be told. The boy at the lake, the girl at the horizon, their stories had always been incomplete, not because they lacked endings, but because they had never been meant to stand alone. They were not two stories. They were two halves, each waiting for a voice strong enough to carry both. The house had known that from the start. The keeper had suspected, though she had not said the words aloud, not to the house, not even to herself. Some truths were too delicate to name before they were ready, like frost forming on the edge of a leaf, too easily melted by the warmth of knowing. But the mist had thinned, and the voice was close. The keeper returned to the table, where the braid lay gleaming in the soft light. She did not touch it, she did not need to. It no longer needed her hands to guide it, no longer needed her breath to shape it. It was awake now, fully awake, not just a story waiting to be told, but a story waiting to be found. The house had always known how to open its door at the right moment. It did not need the keeper's permission. It only needed the voice, the girl in the mist, for it was a girl. The keeper knew that now, did not know she was coming to a house of stories. She did not know what had led her here, why her feet had taken paths she had never walked before, why the mist seemed thinner tonight than on any other night. She only knew that something was calling, a whisper beneath her skin, a breath between her heartbeats. The girl carried no lantern. Her hands were empty, save for a single folded scrap of paper tucked deep inside her coat pocket, words she had written long ago and could not bear to throw away. Words she had never read aloud. The house felt those words, even from afar, because they were part of the story. The silver braid had known them long before the girl herself had written them, because stories always know the voices meant to carry them. Even when those voices are silent, even when those hands are empty, the stories remember. The keeper had seen it before, though rarely. There were those who belonged to stories long before they ever found the house, those whose footsteps followed invisible paths, drawn by threads they could not see. The girl was one of them. The keeper knew she would not arrive tonight. Not yet. The mist was thin, but not gone, and some thresholds take time to cross. But she was close, close enough for the story to feel her breath, close enough for the braid to soften in shape, its edges loosening, its threads opening like a flower toward the light, close enough for the house to leave its door just slightly ajar. The keeper stepped back, letting the house breathe, letting the story breathe, letting the girl's voice reach out across the quiet space between them. She would come, not tonight, but soon, and when she did, the house would be ready, the keeper would be ready, and the story, the silver and gold braid, the boy at the lake, the girl at the horizon, would no longer be waiting. It would be found, it would be heard, and at last it would be told. The mist was thinner now, so thin that, at times, it seemed no more than a breath curling between the trees, the faintest echo of all the stories that had once passed through it. But even the thinnest mist holds weight. The keeper knew this as well as she knew the shape of her own hands, the creak of the house's floor beneath her feet, the soft, steady pulse of the braid lying on the table. The house had been waiting for so long, not with impatience, but with the quiet certainty of places that understand their purpose. It was not a house built for shelter, though it could be that, too. It was not a house built for safety, though within its walls no shadow could cross unbidden. It was a house built for stories, and stories, the keeper knew, always found their way home. The girl was closer now. The keeper could feel her presence through the air, as if her footsteps sent small ripples across the space between them, not loud enough to hear, not strong enough to see, but present all the same. The girl did not know where her feet were taking her. She had set out with no map, no destination, only a weight in her chest and a whisper behind her ribs, a whisper she could not yet understand, only follow. The keeper had felt that whisper once, long ago, when she herself had been the girl. In the mist. Her path had been different, her story her own, but the calling, that soft, wordless pull, was always the same. The house knew it, too. It had opened itself before the girl ever arrived, not wide, not enough to frighten her, but enough that the faintest glimmer of light might touch the mist, a gentle reminder that she was not lost. The silver and gold braid no longer shimmered with uncertainty. Its shape had softened into something fluid, no longer bound to the table where it lay. It had become part of the house itself, part of the air, the walls, the very breath of the place. Stories did that. Once they were awake, they seeped into everything, not to be contained, but to be carried, by the wood that held the house together, by the stones at its foundation, by the air that drifted in through the open door and out again, always searching for the voice meant to tell them. The keeper stood in the doorway, her hands loose at her sides, her breath slow and even. She did not need to call out. The girl would not hear her if she did, not yet. Some paths must be walked in silence, some stories must be found before they can be told, but the keeper could feel the girl's story now, clearer than before, not just a presence, but a shape, a texture, a quiet weight. It was a story with edges worn smooth by time, softened by silence, but still whole beneath it all. It was a story of leaving and longing, of words left unsaid and paths left untaken. A story not unlike the keeper's own. The girl's hands were empty as she walked, her fingers curled lightly against her palms, as if she had once held something there, something precious, something fragile, and had long since let it go. But stories do not vanish, even when they are left behind. They follow, they wait, they find their way home. The mist stirred at the edge of the clearing, curling around the girl's ankles, brushing against the hem of her coat. She paused, her breath catching in her throat, not from fear, but from recognition, though she could not yet name what it was. She knew. The house stood quiet, its windows dark, its door slightly ajar, a waiting place. A listening place. The girl stepped forward, the mist parting gently before her, her footsteps soft against the earth. She did not know where she was going, not really, only that she could not turn back, not now. The keeper stood silent in the doorway, her heart open, her breath steady. She would not greet the girl, she would not speak first. This story was not hers to begin, but when the girl was ready, when her voice found its shape, when her hands were no longer empty, when her story rose from within her like a tide too strong to hold back, the house would be listening, and so would the keeper. For stories, once found, are never truly lost again. The house had always known how to wait. It waited in silence when no footsteps touched its path. It waited in shadow when the mist lay thick and still. It waited in light when a voice stirred just beyond the edge of knowing, searching for the shape of its own story. The keeper knew how to wait, too. She had learned it from the house, or perhaps the house had learned it from her. She no longer remembered which had come first. It didn't matter. In the end, they were the same, the house and the keeper, two halves of something whole, held together by every story that had ever passed through the door. And now, at last, the waiting was over. The girl stood at the edge of the clearing. The mist lay thin around her ankles, parting easily as she stepped forward, one careful foot after the other, as though afraid the earth itself might vanish beneath her weight. But the earth held steady, the air held steady, and the house stood quiet, its door slightly ajar, its windows reflecting the soft, silver glow of the sky. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She did not recognize the house, not truly. She had never been here before, had never walked these woods, had never seen the narrow path that had led her here, and yet, the house knew her. The warmth in the air was not the warmth of summer, nor the flickering heat of a hearth. It was the warmth of recognition, the soft pull of something long familiar. Even if she could not name it, she knew this place. She had always known this place. Her hands curled at her sides, fingers brushing the fabric of her coat, and she felt the folded scrap of paper still tucked deep in her pocket. Words she had written in the quiet dark of too many nights, words she had never shared, not even with herself. They were only fragments, half-thoughts, broken sentences, the loose ends of something that had never fully formed, but the house felt them, the keeper felt them, the stories felt them, because they were part of the braid, the silver and gold braid that had lain on the table for so long, waiting for the voice that could give it shape. The girl stepped closer, the door did not creak. The house did not call to her, there was no grand invitation, no pull stronger than the quiet longing already in her chest, just the soft glow of a single candle, barely visible through the crack in the door, an invitation not spoken, only offered. The girl raised her hand to the wood, her knuckles hovering just above it, but she did not knock. The house was already listening. The keeper stood inside, her hands folded gently in front of her, her heart as steady as her breath. She did not move to open the door wider. The door had already opened as far as it needed to. This moment belonged to the girl, it always had, with one slow breath. The girl laid her palm against the door. The wood was cool beneath her touch, smooth with age, but warm with the hum of stories long held within it. She pushed gently, and the door swung inward without resistance, the candlelight spilling across the threshold in a soft, golden hush. The girl stepped inside. The house shifted around her, not with movement, but with presence, the subtle way air holds the shape of something new, the way silence deepens just before the first word is spoken. She did not call out, she did not need to. The keeper stood at the far end of the room, beside the table where the braid lay, silver and gold, shimmering softly in the candlelight, its edges loose and open. No longer waiting, only ready, the girl's gaze fell on the braid, her brow furrowing slightly, though she did not know why. It felt familiar, it felt like something she had lost and only just remembered she had been searching for. The keeper said nothing. This story was not hers to begin. The girl stepped closer, her breath soft, her hands still curled loosely at her sides. She could not yet see the shape of the story, not fully. Only the glimmer of something beneath the surface, like a reflection on water, too faint to name. But the braid knew, the house knew, the keeper knew, and slowly, so slowly it was almost silent, the girl's hands opened, the scrap of paper slipped free. Unfolding itself in the air, its words soft with age, faint but unbroken, the keeper did not need to read them. She already knew the story they held, because they were part of the same story that had led the boy to the lake and the girl to the horizon, part of the same thread that had pulled the keeper herself to this place so long ago. Stories, once lost, are never truly gone. They wait, in the air, in the earth, in the quiet places between words, and when they are ready, when the voice meant to tell them finally arrives, they remember. The girl's breath shuddered softly in her chest. She did not cry, not yet. There would be time for that, in the telling, for now. She only stepped forward, her hands resting gently on the silver and gold braid, her fingers tracing its edges, her voice silent but steady in her chest. The story had found her, and at last, she was ready to find it, too. The keeper stepped back, her heart full, her hands open, her breath as soft as the candle's flickering flame. This story was no longer waiting, it had been found, and somewhere, far beyond the clearing, where the mist had finally lifted, the first word was ready to be spoken.